gold pocket watch, recovered from the freezing silt of Lake Michigan, remains frozen at exactly 2:30 a.m. Its glass is cracked, its gears are choked with sand, but it marks the precise second a floating palace became a floating coffin. On September 8th, 1860, while the grand ballroom was still echoing with the final notes of an Irish fiddle, the hull was already being sliced open by a silent, dark shape in the storm. But the true mystery isn't how she sank, it's where. As dawn broke, the survivors could see the campfires of rescuers on the shore. They were so close, they could hear the shouts of help, yet they were being pulverized by the very wreckage they clung to for life. It remains the deadliest maritime paradox in history, a mass slaughter that happened within a stone's throw of safety. Was this a tragic act of God, a fatal engineering betrayal, or a cold-blooded desertion in the dark? Stay with us until the final moments of this investigation as we uncover why 300 souls perished when home was only 300 steps away. Let us begin. Why did the PS Lady Elgin was cutting through the black, churning waters of Lake Michigan on that fateful night of September 1860? One must first look past the shimmering chandeliers and into the fractured soul of a nation on the brink of collapse. The year is 1860, and the United States is a nation shivering on the edge of a blade. Abraham Lincoln is aggressively campaigning for the presidency, and the country has become a powder keg of sectional tension, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. But while history books often focus on the grand conflict between the North and the South, a smaller, more bitter struggle was simmering within the streets of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Here, the local Irish immigrant community found themselves caught in a dangerous political crossfire. At the heart of this tension were the Union Guards, a proud Irish militia led by the charismatic captain Garrett Barry. These were men who had fled famine and oppression in Ireland, only to find a new kind of prejudice in the New World. When the abolitionist governor of Wisconsin, Alexander Randall, demanded to know if the Guards would prioritize state orders over federal authority in the event of a civil war, Barry's honest answer that he would remain loyal to the Union triggered a swift and humiliating retaliation. Randall stripped the Guards of their state-issued muskets, effectively disarming and dishonoring a community that saw military service as their ultimate badge of American citizenship. This act of political castration was the silent engine that drove the Lady Elgin out of port. The Union Guards refused to be silenced. They needed to raise funds to purchase their own private cache of arms to prove they were still a force to be reckoned with. They organized a massive, grand excursion from Milwaukee to Chicago, a journey of defiance disguised as a gala. They would travel to hear Lincoln's rival, Stephen A. Douglas, speak at a massive political rally. To carry them, they chartered the finest vessel on the Great Lakes, the PS Lady Elgin. She was a 252-foot sidewheel steamer, a maritime masterpiece often called the Queen of the Lakes. For the more than 400 passengers on board, many of them the Irish political and social elite of Milwaukee, this ship was the physical manifestation of their rising status. It was a floating palace of velvet and mahogany, a sanctuary where they could forget, if only for a day, the brewing storm of the American Civil War. As the vessel departed Chicago for the return leg of the trip late on September 7th, the atmosphere inside the Grand Saloon was one of exuberant triumph. The air was thick with the scent of fine tobacco, expensive brandy, and the rhythmic, frantic energy of Irish fiddles. Couples whirled across polished oak floors under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, their laughter muffled by heavy velvet curtains that shielded them from the darkening horizon. This was the pinnacle of mid-19th century luxury, a world where the brutal reality of the lake was kept at bay by iron and steam. To the passengers, the rhythmic thump-thump of the massive 30-foot paddle wheels wasn't a mechanical noise. It was a heartbeat of invincibility. They believed in the god of steam, a power that had conquered the vast distances of the frontier. However, beneath this veneer of Victorian opulence lay a structural fragility that no amount of gold leaf could hide. The Lady Elgin was a sidewheeler, an architectural design that was rapidly becoming an evolutionary dead end in the face of the Great Lakes' unpredictable fury. The engineering of the Lady Elgin was a study in compromise. To maintain her reputation for speed and elegance, she was built with a shallow draft and a high, top-heavy center of gravity. Her hull was constructed of white oak, pliant and sturdy under normal conditions, but lacking the rigid resilience of the iron-hulled ships that would soon replace her. The most critical vulnerability, however, lay in her very means of propulsion. The two massive paddle wheels were mounted on the sponsons, extensions of the deck that hung over the sides of the hull. This design created a structural nightmare. The sponsons were the one place where the ship's primary frame was compromised to accommodate the heavy machinery. In a high-speed collision, these areas acted less like a shield and more like a funnel, guiding any impacting force directly into the ship's vital organs. Furthermore, the sidewheel design robbed the Lady Elgin of the maneuverability required for survival in a crisis. Unlike modern ships with stern-mounted propellers that can pivot on a dime, the Lady Elgin had the turning radius of a city block. In the tight, unlit shipping lanes of Lake Michigan, she was a blind giant, unable to dodge a sudden predator emerging from the fog. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the weather began to deteriorate with a violence that only the Great Lakes can summon. A squall. A sudden, fierce windstorm hit the lake, turning the water into a chaos of white-capped peaks. The temperature plummeted, and the air became a blinding curtain of rain and spray. Inside the wheelhouse, the captain gripped the brass railing, peering into a darkness so absolute that the bow of his own ship was barely visible. On the lakes in 1860, there were no universal regulations for navigational lights. Ships often operated in dark mode to save on expensive whale oil, or carried only a single dim lantern that was easily obscured by the crest of a wave. The Lady Elgin was steaming at nearly full speed through this blackness, her engines roaring as coal stokers shoveled fuel into the blazing furnaces below. The speed was a matter of pride and schedule, a fatal arrogance that ignored the fact that they were essentially flying blind through a graveyard. The technical reality of the situation was a catastrophe waiting for a single, violent catalyst. In the middle of a gale, a sidewheel steamer like the Lady Elgin becomes a prisoner of its own physics. Those massive, iconic paddle wheel housings, once symbols of power, now acted as giant, unwanted sails, catching the furious winds and forcing the ship off course. To maintain any semblance of steerage, the engines had to be pushed to their breaking point. Below decks, the wooden timber frame groaned under the agonizing stress, sending rhythmic shudders through the mahogany-lined cabins. It was a structural warning cry, a signal that the Queen was being pushed far beyond her limits. Yet, in the grand saloon above, the party showed no signs of slowing down. Insulated by wealth and the comforting roar of the machinery, the passengers mistook the ship's violent vibrations for mere mechanical strength. They laughed, they danced, and they toasted to their safe return. They had no way of knowing that the darkness ahead was not empty. As the PS Lady Elgin steamed north into the teeth of the rising gale, she was no longer a vessel of celebration, but a vulnerable target moving through a world of absolute, unregulated starlight. Emerging from that same ink-black darkness was her structural antithesis, the Augusta. To understand the physics of the impending disaster, one must look at the Augusta not merely as a ship, but as a specialized maritime weapon. She was a two-masted schooner, a workhorse of the lakes designed for one utilitarian purpose, transporting massive, dense payloads of lumber. Unlike the Lady Elgin, which was hollowed out to accommodate soaring grand saloons and elegant passenger cabins, the Augusta was dead weight personified. Her hold was packed tight with heavy timber, making her hull incredibly dense, rigid, and nearly submerged. In the unforgiving physics of maritime collisions, mass is king. While the Lady Elgin was a fast, fragile queen, constructed of intricate joinery and aesthetic flourishes, the Augusta was a blunt, wooden arrow, slicing through the waves with a momentum that no wooden hull of that era could hope to withstand. The tragedy was set in motion by a lethal regulatory vacuum. In 1860, the maritime laws of the Great Lakes were a chaotic relic of a slower, less crowded era. There was no federal mandate requiring ships to carry navigational lights. A running light was considered a costly luxury rather than a survival requirement. On this night, the Augusta carried no lights at all. Her captain, Cyrus Wheeler, was navigating by pure instinct and the occasional jarring flash of lightning. Even if the Lady Elgin's crew had been scanning the horizon with perfect vigilance, the physics of 19th century illumination worked against them. The primitive oil lanterns of the time produced a weak, yellowish spectrum that was easily swallowed by the squall. In a heavy storm, the mist and airborne spray act as a liquid prism, refracting and scattering low-intensity light until it becomes virtually invisible against the frothing whitecaps. This created a literal dark zone on the lake, a blind spot where two massive vessels could occupy the same square mile of water, completely oblivious to each other's existence until the distance between them was too short to turn. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the invisible became the inevitable. Through the driving sheets of rain, the watchman on the Lady Elgin caught a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of a dark shape looming off the port side. There was no time for a maneuver. The Lady Elgin's massive side wheels lacked the torque to pivot her 252-foot frame in seconds. The Augusta, driven by the full force of the gale and her own massive internal weight, slammed her sharpened, timber-reinforced bow directly into the Lady Elgin's port side, striking just aft of the massive paddle wheel. This was the Achilles heel of the steamer's design. The impact did not merely dent the hull, it shunted the paddle wheel's heavy iron axle inward like a battering ram, shattering the primary structural supports of the ship's spine. The Augusta's bow acted like a cold chisel, slicing through the white oak planks and opening a gaping, irreversible wound below the waterline. For a few terrifying seconds, the two ships were locked in a macabre embrace of grinding wood and snapping iron, a cacophony of destruction drowned out by the thunder before the Augusta bounced off and drifted back into the swirling blackness, leaving a hole that no pump could ever hope to empty. The technical death of the Lady Elgin followed with agonizing mechanical speed. As freezing Lake Michigan water surged into the breach, it headed straight for the heart of the vessel, the boiler room. This triggered a catastrophic chain reaction known as thermal shock. When thousands of gallons of icy water hit the red-hot iron boilers, the steam pressure, the very lifeblood of the ship, plummeted instantly. The massive engines, which provided the only power to fight the storm and pump the bilges, groaned and seized in a cloud of scalding vapor. This wasn't just a loss of propulsion. It was a total systemic failure. The lights, powered by the steam-driven dynamo effect of the engines, flickered and died, plunging the screaming passengers into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Without the engines to keep the ship headed into the waves, the Lady Elgin became a dead weight, a log at the mercy of the lake. Within minutes, the rising water pushed the air trapped in the lower hull upward with such immense pressure that the main deck boards began to buckle and snap like toothpicks. The Queen didn't just sink. She imploded from the inside out, her structural spine snapping as she was pulverized by the very elements she was built to conquer. In the immediate wake of the collision, as the two vessels drifted apart into the swirling blackness, a second, more profound tragedy began to unfold. One not of iron and oak, but of moral cowardice and catastrophic misjudgment. Captain Cyrus Wheeler of the Augusta, standing on his own splintered deck, made a fateful, chilling decision that would haunt maritime history for decades. After a cursory inspection of his damaged bow, Wheeler realized his ship was still buoyant, held afloat by the very cargo of lumber that had turned his vessel into a lethal battering ram. Yet, instead of turning back, he ordered his crew to set sails for Chicago. This was a psychological desertion that defied the most basic laws of the sea. Some historians argue it was a moment of pure, blinding panic. The crew of the Augusta genuinely believed they were the ones in mortal danger, convinced that the massive Lady Elgin had steamed away unscathed into the night. But as the wind carried the desperate, piercing screams of hundreds of men, women, and children across the freezing water, that excuse began to wither. Whether driven by a panicked instinct for self-preservation or a cold-blooded disregard for the lives of immigrant excursionists, Wheeler's disappearance ensured that the victims had zero hope of rescue from the very vessel that had struck them. The Augusta vanished into the storm like a ghost, leaving the Queen of the Lakes to die alone in the dark. In that moment, a tragic maritime accident was transformed into a profound moral atrocity. It raises a haunting question that lingers long after the wreckage settled. Was the Augusta's flight a desperate act of survival by a terrified crew, or a calculated abandonment of humanity? By the time Wheeler reached the safety of Chicago, he had already left a trail of dying souls in his wake, marking the exact moment the Lady Elgin was officially condemned to become a floating coffin. On the violently tilting decks of the PS Lady Elgin, Captain Jack Wilson began a desperate, doomed battle against the laws of physics and the relentless ingress of Lake Michigan. The moment the schooner Augusta retracted from the collision, a gaping wound was left below the waterline on the steamer's port side. In a frantic bid to save his ship, Wilson ordered the heavy cargo, including tons of livestock, to be hurled into the dark abyss. He hoped that by shedding this weight, the vessel would list enough to raise the breach above the surging waves. Below decks, the scene was one of claustrophobic terror. In the suffocating darkness of the coal bunkers, stewards and crewmen engaged in a primitive, improvised surgery on the ship's hull. They fought to plug the gushing torrent with mattresses, blankets, and anything they could shove into the splintering oak. Wilson ordered a lifeboat lowered on the starboard side to assess the external damage, but the small craft was instantly devoured by the churning vortex, disappearing forever. Within a mere 20 minutes, the structural spine of the Lady Elgin failed entirely. The Queen of the Lakes did not simply sink, she disintegrated. The magnificent vessel splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, leaving only the bow section to drift momentarily before it, too, was claimed by the depths. The transition from a luxury steamer, where just hours before, a German brass band had filled the air with upbeat melodies, to a chaotic scattering of wreckage, was a descent into primal, unmitigated horror. As the ship broke apart, hundreds of passengers were thrust into the black, freezing void of the lake. This was the moment of initial immersion, where the sudden shock of the 40 degrees Fahrenheit water induced gasping and immediate panic. In this absolute chaos, the 19th century safety standards proved to be a cruel, lethal joke. The official life preservers, heavy slabs of 2-inch thick hardwood, were essentially useless anchors. Few, if any, were utilized. Instead, the survivors engaged in a desperate scramble for anything that defied gravity. They clawed at heavy oak doors, jagged sections of the cabin roof, and fragments of the grand saloon. In one of the most surreal images of the night, Charles Beverung, the drummer for the band, managed to save his life by using his oversized bass drum as a makeshift buoy, paddling through the freezing spray. This scene was made even more tragic by a permanent erasure of human identity. As the purser's office was engulfed by water, the official passenger manifest, the only definitive record of the souls on board, was lost to the silt. In an instant, hundreds of living, breathing individuals were transformed into blank spaces in the historical record. This single event effectively wiped their names from history, turning an exact death toll into a haunting estimation that remains debated to this day. Amidst this screaming darkness, Captain Wilson emerged as a flickering beacon of hope. Survivors later recounted his legendary superhuman efforts to gather nearly 300 people onto a massive, makeshift raft, a floating island of debris. He acted as a human shield against the encroaching lake, shouting encouragement and fighting to keep the group together as they drifted through the night. As dawn finally broke, a cruel irony of geography was revealed to the exhausted survivors. The wind and current had pushed them within sight of the shore, the high, muddy bluffs of Winnetka and Evanston, Illinois. To many, the sight of land felt like salvation, but in the physics of maritime disaster, they were entering the slaughter zone. The surf zone on the Great Lakes is often more lethal than the open sea. As the massive storm waves hit the shallow, sandy shelf near the beach, their energy was compressed into a violent, hydraulic undertow. This receding water acted like a giant, invisible hand, dragging swimmers back under just as their fingers touched the sand. The shoreline became a literal grinding machine. Under the relentless force of the breaking waves, the heavy timber beams and iron pipes of the Lady Elgin were tossed like projectiles. Victims were caught in a lethal pincer between the unyielding rocky beach and thousands of pounds of churning, splintered oak. Many who had survived hours in the open lake were pulverized by the wreckage of their own ship just yards from safety. It was in this chaotic surf that Captain Wilson met his end. While heroically attempting to save 2 women from the white water, he was struck by a massive wave and dashed against the unforgiving rocks. His death symbolized the final collapse of the ship's hierarchy. The protector was gone, and the survivors were now entirely on their own. However, from the top of the Winnetka Bluffs, a new form of heroism emerged. A crowd of horrified onlookers, including students from Northwestern University, watched the carnage unfold. One student, a young divinity student named Edward Spencer, refused to remain a spectator. He tied a rope around his waist, handed the end to his classmates, and dove repeatedly into the freezing, debris-choked surf. For 6 agonizing hours, Spencer battled the undertow. 17 times he disappeared into the foam. 17 times he emerged dragging a gasping survivor to the beach. His body was battered by floating timber and his skin flayed by the cold, yet he refused to stop until his physical strength was utterly evaporated. Although Edward Spencer's name was recorded as a symbol of courage, we must confront the somber reality that Spencer's heroism saved 17 lives, but the physical rescue was merely the first chapter of a lifelong personal tragedy. On that morning, the 24-year-old divinity student tied a rope to his waist and dove into the grinding machine of the surf 17 separate times. While he succeeded in dragging 17 gasping souls to the safety of the sand, the physical and psychological toll was catastrophic. Spencer spent the remaining 30 years of his life as a broken man, both in body and spirit. Today, we recognize his condition as a debilitating case of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, coupled with severe survivor's guilt. He was not haunted by the 17 he saved, but by the hundreds of reaching hands he could not grasp. On his deathbed in 1890, his mind returned to the freezing, debris-choked surf of Winnetka, and he reportedly whispered the same question that had tormented his every waking hour. Did I do my full duty? His life stands as a testament to the fact that for those who survive such a mechanical slaughter, the hell in the surf never truly ends. The sinking of the PS Lady Elgin was far more than a maritime disaster. It was a profound societal decapitation that fundamentally reconfigured the American Midwest and sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. As the black, turbulent waters of Lake Michigan finally settled over the splintered remains of the Queen of the Lakes, the city of Milwaukee awoke to a reality that had been permanently, violently altered. The Irish community, particularly the vibrant Third Ward, had been hollowed out in a single stroke of fate. Because this excursion was a high-profile political rallying event, the ship carried the neighborhood's most influential figures, prosperous business owners, budding local politicians, and the entire disciplined leadership of the Union Guards militia. In a single night, the social and political nervous system of the Irish in Milwaukee was severed, leaving a community of immigrants leaderless and vulnerable in a time of national crisis. The sheer scale of this communal trauma is best understood through the staggering loss of human potential. While initial sensationalist reports, fueled by the frantic chaos of the era, claimed that over 1,000 children were left orphaned, rigorous historical research has since corrected this figure to fewer than 40. However, the qualitative loss was immeasurable. The disappearance of nearly the entire Union Guards meant that the most organized and politically active segment of the Irish population had vanished. This created a vacuum of power so absolute that it shifted the entire ethnic and political landscape of the city, effectively transferring the architectural balance of influence from the Irish to the German immigrant population. This shift would go on to dominate Milwaukee's political and industrial identity for the next century. The Lady Elgin didn't just take lives, it sank the collective future of an entire ethnic enclave. As the last of the bodies were brought ashore and raw grief began to crystallize into a burning public outrage, the machinery of 19th century law began to grind. Yet, instead of offering solace, the proceedings in a Chicago courtroom revealed a chilling reality. In 1860, the lives of 300 human beings were often worth less than the price of a single lantern. Captain Darius Malott of the Augusta was arrested and stood trial for negligence, but in a verdict that sent shockwaves through the nation, he was cleared of all charges. The Board of Inquiry delivered a scathing and cynical decision, shifting the entire weight of the blame onto the second mate, Mr. Budge, and the crew, labeling them as incompetent, while in reality, this verdict rested upon a maritime legal framework that was laughably obsolete. At that time, sailing vessels were granted absolute right-of-way over steamers, and federal law lacked any mandate requiring schooners to carry navigational lights. This meant that even though the Augusta had been operating in dark mode to save on whale oil and had spotted the Lady Elgin 20 minutes prior to the collision, their catastrophic misjudgment of the distance in the rain was considered legally valid. The sting of this injustice was made even more agonizing when leading experts, including Professor Mason and Lieutenant Bartlett, asserted that the entire slaughter could have been entirely prevented by a single lantern costing a mere $15. It was the arrogance of the system and these lethal legal loopholes that created a dead zone on Lake Michigan, and it would take another 4 years for a new regulation to finally mandate lights on sailing vessels, a change that came far too late for the souls resting on the lakebed. Meanwhile, the owner of the Lady Elgin, Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard, walked away with a $12,000 insurance settlement, a fortune at the time, of which not a single cent reached the families who had lost their primary breadwinners. Furthermore, both Hubbard and the insurers stubbornly refused to formally abandon the vessel, igniting legal battles over the ownership of the wreckage that would span over a century. Steamboat historian Peter Charlebois noted with bitterness that following the investigation, every powerful figure, from Captain Malott to the ship owners, was absolved of all responsibility. The system had effectively protected itself, leaving 300 souls without justice and serving as a haunting testament to how progress and profit consistently outpaced the most basic rules of human safety, turning the Lady Elgin tragedy into a painful reminder that humanity was sacrificed for the sake of the status quo. For over 120 years since that fateful night, the Lady Elgin lay silent in her watery grave at the bottom of Lake Michigan, carrying with her untold secrets and unnamed treasures, until shipwreck hunter Harry Zeich officially discovered the site in 1989 off the coast of Highland Park, Illinois. This discovery was not only a technical achievement, but also ignited a decade-long legal battle over ownership, where Zeich faced off against the state of Illinois and insurance companies that had never formally abandoned the vessel since 1860. During the proceedings, fascinating details of the lakebed were revealed when Zeich testified to finding the ship safe, sitting intact on the seafloor. Inside, time seemed to stand still, preserving 70 gold and silver coins along with 2 gold pocket watches that were subsequently placed in the care of a court-appointed custodian. After years of fierce litigation, the court finally awarded ownership of the wreck to Zeich in 1999, clearing the way for in-depth archaeological surveys led by diver Valerie Van Heest and the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago. Reconnaissance surveys in 1992 painted a haunting picture of devastation at depths of 50 to 60 feet, where the wreck is separated into 4 primary debris fields: the bow, the boiler system, the massive paddle wheels, and a scattered field of fragments from the lives once lived on board. Although Zeich never donated his recovered artifacts to a museum, the current of history found its own path in 2023, when a collection of approximately 160 artifacts was donated by another diver to the Chicago Maritime Museum, creating a moving exhibition space designed by Van Heest based on her meticulous research. However, the final and most poignant piece of this tragedy did not truly emerge until 2025, when the discovery of a gold pocket watch from 1992 was made public, featuring engravings and a wax seal fob bearing the initials HI. This precious item was the personal relic of Herbert Ingram. He was the founder of the renowned Illustrated London News and a distinguished member of the British Parliament. Traveling with his young son, they were the only foreign nationals on board. Ingram was widely considered the most globally influential figure on the vessel, a titan of the Victorian media world. The death of both him and his son meant that the Lady Elgin remains, to this day, the shipwreck with the most prominent and wealthiest loss of life in the history of the Great Lakes. The fact that a man of Ingram's stature perished so close to the American shore forced the world to take notice of the unregulated dangers of these inland seas. And following unsuccessful attempts to locate his living descendants, the watch was returned by Valerie Van Heest to his hometown of Boston, England. Today, that watch rests within the Boston Guildhall Museum, not far from the statue honoring Ingram that has stood since 1862. This small gold timepiece, once ticking against the chest of a man who helped bring clean water and railways to his people, now stands as a silent, frozen witness to the night when $15 worth of light could have saved a generation. A Wisconsin historical marker in Milwaukee's historic Third Ward commemorates this tragedy. Calvary Cemetery in Milwaukee features a monument dedicated specifically to the Lady Elgin disaster, and many who perished in the tragedy are buried there. In 1861, musician Henry Clay Work penned the memorial song, "Lost on the Lady Elgin." For decades, across central Canada and the American Midwest, this song became an essential melody at family gatherings and social occasions. Its notes carried the weight of 300 souls into the private homes of those who remained. In this sense, the music became the only passenger manifest that did not sink, a living record of a night that words alone could not describe. The story of the Lady Elgin serves as a perennial warning to the modern world. We often wait for a pile of bodies before we implement the rules that could have prevented the slaughter. From the Titanic to the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, and even into the digital age of autonomous shipping, the Lady Elgin lens reveals a recurring human arrogance, the belief that our machines are invincible until the moment they fail. We continue to navigate the dark zones of new technology with the same blind speed that Captain Wilson used to steam through the fog of 1860. The Queen of the Lakes was a fast, elegant, and completely blind machine, a mirror of our own tendency to prioritize progress over precaution. Today, if you walk through the quiet, windswept cemeteries of Milwaukee, you will find monuments with blank spaces, names that were never recovered because the official passenger manifest sank into the silt of the lakebed. These stones stand as silent witnesses to a night when home was only 300 steps away, yet was utterly unreachable. They remind us that in the intersection of systemic negligence and sudden catastrophe, the cost is always paid in human souls. As we close this investigation into the deadliest open water tragedy in Great Lakes history, we are left to wonder about the fragile thread of fate. In the blackness of that storm, between the screams for help and the vanishing sails of the Augusta, a single choice defined the destiny of 300 people. Amidst the darkness of such profound negligence, how much light of hope would have been enough to save just one more soul? If the Augusta had turned back, or if one lantern had been lit, would the history of a city and the lives of those 300 souls be different? Finally, before concluding today's message, thank you for standing with us in the shadow of this history. If this journey through the dark waters of Lake Michigan touched you, please like, share, and follow to ensure these souls are never forgotten. If you have your own stories or reflections on this maritime tragedy, please share them with us in the comments. Until next time, I'll see you in our next video.